Hey everyone, today we're going to be diving into the world of Utility-First CSS. Now, this is a methodology that has become increasingly popular over the last couple years, and for good reason, and we'll get into why in this presentation. Now, if you haven't yet had a chance to dig into this philosophy, or maybe you're a bit skeptical of it all, hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have some insight into the thinking behind it, how it can be beneficial for you and your team, and maybe you'll consider using it on your next project. Now, there are going to be 4 areas that we'll look into today as it relates to this concept of utility-first CSS. First, we're going to look at what utility-first CSS is and how that may be different than the processes you maybe used in the past or that you're used to. We're going to also talk about what type of mindset you should have as a developer going into this whole process, what should be on your mind when you start working this way. We're going to look into some tools that make working this way really easy. And shout out to Tailwind Labs. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about their open source projects and their commercial projects today that really champion this way of thinking, this utility first CSS thinking. And Tailwind Labs is the makers behind Tailwind CSS, which has again become immensely popular in championing this way of thinking over the last couple years. And then finally, we're going to talk about how you can implement these concepts into your next project. And specifically, we're going to talk about agencies and small studios, groups that have multiple developers working on projects. How embracing utility-first CSS can actually improve your development workflow, increase the speed of your developers, make onboarding new developers onto projects a lot more seamless, a lot easier, and we'll talk about how this all plays into the workflow of working on CMS-driven projects. But before we get into all that, quickly just want to talk about who I am for a second. My name is Kyle Cotter. I am the author experience lead at HappyCog, and my job there is to make sure that our CMS-based projects are as intuitive and logically organized as possible. Now, obviously, that starts with the control panel and how we group our content in the CMS, how we set up our fields, how we organize them all. But part of that also extends to how our templates are structured, how our front-end workflow really empowers those content decisions that were made in the planning phase in the control panel, how it's all set up. So questions that come up are we properly leveraging the power of embeds and includes within the template engine? And this really circles back to how utility-first CSS comes into play when thinking through those concepts. So it's all related in the world of CMS-driven projects. Now, these these principles can apply to all different types of projects, but today, specifically, we're going to be focusing on how they can improve CMS-based projects. So with that, let's talk about what utility-first CSS is. Well, it's probably better to start with what it's not. That's probably going to give us a better foundation to see why it's a major improvement over things in the past. Now, BEM and SMACs are probably something you're all very familiar with if you're a front-end developer. These are very popular approaches to how to configure CSS files, how to write CSS. You've probably written and or seen something very similar to these two snippets. We have corresponding classes here that do very specific things. We have classes that modify particular things or are contextually dependent on a parent of some sort. So this markup is very contextually based in the whole component. So say how semantic. Yes, it's very semantic in how it's written. Now, this might not look bad to manage now, but as the project scales up in complexity, as you start dealing with variations, questions around whether these classes get reused in different contexts, whether They're very similar design patterns, but they're in different components. So are the namings no longer applicable? Then you start getting into specificity order, whether things are nested properly, what happens when we need to add something very similar, but in a different area. It just starts to get very complicated, hard to manage, and becomes a nightmare. In order to solve this, maybe you're duplicating code in CSS, maybe style properties are getting applied to multiple classes even though they're doing the same thing in many places. Yeah, it's not great. Our complex design logic is being solved entirely in the CSS file. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that approach. The complexity and logic to handle those different variations, like that has to be defined somewhere. It's just currently being defined in the CMS, in the CSS, excuse me. Now, I'd argue that as the complexity scales over time, as new components are being created, it gets harder and harder to maintain that CSS, where each class is very specific in its context. It does a very specific thing. Then when you need to add a couple small things, you start to cheat. CSS is very easy to just add layers and layers on top of each other. We've all done it. I've done it. Just to get the next thing done, you start cutting corners to get things to work. And it'll work, but don't spend too much time thinking about what happens behind the curtain. Now, I'd say there's no greater sense of dread when working with CSS than when you are brought into an existing project, or you've even inherited an entire project from somebody else and has an existing code base. You have to have fun trying to figure out what flavor of BEM or SMACs that they're using and what extra fun things maybe they hid in the code base to do various things just to keep up with the pace of new components or adjustments that need to happen on the project. So all of that, I'm no thanks. No thanks to any of that. Now, here's an example of an element that is using utility-based CSS classes. Now, let's say that this is for a section heading, something like that. Now, you might say, gross, but honestly, if you look at what the classes are here, can you honestly not say that from reading them, you don't get a sense of what's going on here just by looking at the class names attached to this h1 tag? If we look at it, it seems like there's some text sizing happening. There's some spacing and kerning happening. Looks like some extra bold weight is applied, colors applied. There's these SM : prefixed things on here. Okay, I don't know what that is, but then finally we're going to center the text. Okay, so aside from those two things, which if I'm looking at the context of everything else, I see the text size is defined elsewhere, the leading is defined elsewhere. Okay, it looks like those might have to do with responsive styling. That text 3XL is the default style, and then it's getting overridden to text 4XL depending on a screen size. That makes a lot of sense, and I could discern all that just from looking at this one h1 tag and the classes applied to it. I don't have to go searching through nested layers of CSS. It's pretty explicit. Now, the critics are going to say, well, that's not semantic. And okay, that's not semantic by means of the true definition of the word, but I would say it's definitely written in a very functional way. You can tell me what's happening just by looking at it. You don't have to go digging through code. It's very explicit and it's functionally named. I think that's better. Now, some common objections to all of that are, well, doesn't this go against everything we were taught when we were first learning HTML and CSS? Isn't this just like using inline styles? Isn't this hard to maintain going forward? How does this promote reusability? They're all very valid points if you've never tried this system before. The quickest way to get the answer to all of these is to try them yourself. Speaking specifically to the inline styles comment, inline styles are free-for-all in that you can define any CSS property you want on an HTML element. Just because we are using a lot of utility classes in this approach, a lot of time and thought has been put into the API behind it to still have a logical flow to how things are set up. So it's not the same as inline CSS tags. There is an API that you're expected to follow and use, and how to add very structured things to your HTML elements. Now, let's throw it back to something I'm sure we're all familiar with, CSS Zen Garden. Now, this is the epitome of what people say shows the power of separation of concerns. You have one HTML file with semantic class names, and that file never changes. And then by changing the CSS and only the CSS, you can have an infinite amount of designs. And that's true. That's great, actually. CSS Zen Garden, it shows the power of CSS and what it can do, because CSS is powerful, it's flexible, and dare I say it, it can be fun. And I think it's important that people understand that. But honestly, as you're working on project to project, even on site refresh to site refresh, is your HTML markup really staying the same? Well, probably not. The other concern that comes up a lot is separation of concerns. Like, things need to be separate. The HTML needs to worry only about hierarchy. The CSS needs to worry about the presentation layer. And that's the point of CSS Zen Garden, to illustrate that separation. Now, there's a quote from the Vue.js documentation that I think really hits the nail on the head here. It says, separation of concerns is not equal to separation of file types. Yes, separation of concerns is important. And one of the biggest arguments against this functional utility-based CSS is that it goes against separation of concerns, but I really don't think it does that. The case is that CSS should strictly be in charge of styling. HTML should be semantically structuring the page. Now, just because you're composing class names on HTML nodes, which is then applying the styles, that does not mean that you are styling things in HTML. You are still handling the entire presentation layer through CSS. You're just applying classes to HTML elements that does that. But the actual design processing is still handled entirely on the CSS side of things. So, while we're not necessarily doing things explicitly in different file types, I'd still say we have our separation of concerns pretty clear. All right, so we talked a lot about what this isn't. What we're trying to solve. We looked at one example of how this starts to come together, but really, what is Utility-First CSS? Now, this is my own definition, and excuse how long and wordy it is, but it's a really straightforward concept. I define this as a set of low-level classes, each one that's set out to do one specific thing, that when you combine them with a bunch of other low-level classes in the HTML, this allows you to create flexible components, ones that can be extracted and reused, all while keeping one naming convention to remember from project to project. So the core idea here is I remember one set of class names that do very specific things. That will go with me from project to project. I don't have to keep relearning a very unique set of class names. So if we go back to CSS Zen Garden, let's imagine a world where instead of the HTML remaining consistent, it's the CSS class names and the CSS itself that remained consistent. Each class name was doing one very specific thing. Add to that, I can structure my markup and set up my design all from in one file, that one HTML template file. Sounds pretty good to me. Now, if we're going to stick with this utility-first approach, and if we're going to really commit to this mindset, here are some things that I want my workflow to do, some things I want to keep in mind while using this approach. Again, first and foremost, I want a set of class names that I can reuse from project to project. I want to have CSS do its thing, but I don't want to have to mess with CSS or edit a file directly if I don't have to. I want to promote collaboration, let multiple developers work on different components, different pages. And from the CSS level, I don't want there to be any sort of confusion or fear of duplicating code, conflicts. I don't want to have to write a bunch of custom nested components that do specific things when another developer is doing something very similar for something else. I don't want any of that. I don't want to have to write tons of custom CSS that have to deal with specificity or overriding or layering on top of layer, especially when it comes to down the road when we're adding incremental things to a project. I want to be able to come in, see what's going on, adjust something, get out. And that all plays to the idea of let me do things faster, let me code faster, let me get things in a production ready state faster. All the while, I understand the need for keeping things dry. I don't want to have code spaghetti, all these class names all over the place. I want to be logical and keep things organized. All right, so if we keep these rough principles in mind as we're going through this process, I think we're going to end up in a pretty good state. So let's talk about Tailwind Labs. Tailwind Labs is the parent company of a number of popular tools that are championing this utility-first space. Adam Wathan and Steve Shoger are the masterminds behind this company. And they started with Tailwind CSS, which is probably the most popular CSS framework that's embracing this philosophy to date. And this is obviously what we're going to focus on primarily through the rest of this presentation, how we can utilize Tailwind CSS in its concepts of utility-first CSS. Now, there's a couple other great tools that the folks at Tailwind Labs have created that is worth highlighting. And it pairs nicely with Tailwind CSS so that you can get the full experience for what's going on here. So this is actually brand new, as in like yesterday afternoon or yesterday morning brand new. It's called Tailwind Play, and it's a sandbox environment for setting up and playing around with Tailwind CSS. This is great if you are skeptical or have not had a chance to get your feet wet with it. It is a sandbox environment to test out Tailwind, and we're going to take a look at this later on and see how we can mock up a couple components pretty quickly in it. Then there's Tailwind UI. So everything else we just discussed is open source, freely accessible. Tailwind UI is their commercial product, which is a set of pre-configured components for both marketing sites and application development. They are pre-configured HTML and CSS using Tailwind that you can copy and paste to get started in your own projects with these prefabbed components. This is commercial, but it's built on top of Tailwind CSS. And it's a great place to learn how the team at Tailwind builds their components and how they're thinking about how the different class names work together. And it's a really great resource, even if you don't have anything to build per se. It's a great resource just to have access to see how they're using Tailwind on their side. So highly recommend it. There are a couple other things that we'll just do an honorary mention here. Hero icons is something that they had created, which is a batch of SVG icons that are specifically built to work with Tailwind CSS and how it handles utility classes. The SVG icons look great, and the fact that they work with Tailwind just makes it even better. And then finally, we'll give a shout out to Headless UI, which is a brand new initiative from them. It's a new framework that is very actively being worked on. And the idea, still in the concept of this utility-based space, is they've created these libraries that are components for a bunch of different JavaScript frameworks that are headless in that they don't include any design markup with it. So things like select list, drop-down lists, things that you might normally do in JavaScript like view. These are components that are accessible and ready to go out of the box that you then bring your own design markup. Obviously, it's built to work exactly compatibly with Tailwind CSS. So you can drop your own Tailwind CSS classes into these components and have fully functional, fully accessible components that are done in JavaScript. So it's a great library framework that I would encourage you to check out as well. So let's go back to the star of the rest of our presentation, Tailwind CSS. So what exactly is it? We know it's related to utility Utility-First CSS. Well, the documentation has a good description of what it does. And most CSS frameworks do too much, which if you think of something like Bootstrap or Bulma, things like that, they have a lot of opinionated pre-designed components out of the box, which Tailwind does not. Tailwind provides low-level utility classes that let you build completely custom designs without ever leaving your HTML. That's the selling point right there. If you're sick of fighting the framework, overriding unwanted styles, and battling specificity wars, Tailwind was made for you. This sounds perfect. I mean, that's why we like CMS's like Expression Engine. They don't assume anything about our structure coming in. It fits what we need it to fit. So why should our CSS framework be any different? That's the main selling point right there. So what else comes with Tailwind? What else makes it so great? Here's a list of things in no particular order of why Tailwind is so great. It makes you template with a component-first approach. And this is really where the benefit to these CMS type projects comes into play. We're really thinking about things in components and how we can reuse them at the CMS level. Tailwind is completely responsive out of the box. We looked briefly at a couple examples of how to apply some responsive breakpoints within the class names without leaving the HTML. Totally a game changer in speed in that area. It's totally customizable. There are defaults that come out of the box regarding things like text size, colors, spacing. All those scales are completely customizable. You can extend what currently comes with Tailwind out of the box, or you can throw it all away and write your own configuration file, no problem. And because of that, there are no prefabricated assumptions. It integrates with popular build processes. It's actually a post-CSS plugin. Tailwind CSS is just a post-CSS plugin, so it'll work nicely with things like Webpack, roll-up thing, build processes like that. And from what we already looked at it's pretty easy to understand. Once you understand the naming conventions, it's very straightforward to look at a number of components and understand what's happening without having to dig around. Tailwind CSS is also great for working with multiple developers because you already have your CSS framework foundation. Everyone knows what classes to work off of. There's not room for a lot of conflicts in the CSS area. And one thing that can't be understated or overstated enough is the documentation for Tailwind CSS is amazing. It's one of the best documentation setups that I have seen for not just an open source project, but for a lot of commercial projects too. It's got really great documentation, which makes it incredibly easy to learn. And the fact that you only have to learn the documentation once and then you're set for life in all your projects, that's a really major selling point. There are lots of examples, lots of ways to configure Tailwind, all within documentation. So that can't be stressed enough how great and helpful that is. So enough of me talking. I think the best way to really demonstrate how Tailwind works and the power of it is really the demo on this homepage of the Tailwind CSS site really speaks for itself. Let's take a look and see here what happens. So we started with just plain HTML, and now we've gone through and added some classes to this, what looks like a card component. And now we're adding some additional classes to handle some of the responsive states. And just like that, you have a card component that is both ready for desktop and mobile. And that took about 20 seconds. That's crazy. The level of flexibility that you had just from editing that one template. So let's talk about some more specifics. The class names were very sensible. A lot of time and thought was put into how things were named here. Again, going back to inline CSS, I know a lot of time and thought was put into what things should be named. Things don't get changed. Their name doesn't get changed unless there's a good reason and it's properly versioned so that if there are breaking changes, you're aware of it. There was a lot of time and sweat that went into the API configuration. If we look at the documentation, just to show you how great it is, this is an example of how the padding spacing works. P dash number indicates the padding on an element. P x dash number indicates x coordinate padding, y for vertical padding. Again, very sensible names. Now, if we look at the documentation here, we see our scale at the top and what the options come out of the box. Then we get visual representations for what each class does so you understand how it functions. And then at the bottom, there are documentation for how to extend your configuration file to either add more padding options or to completely replace the padding scale and insert your own. And this is the same setup for every class in Tailwind. You get a detailed page like this to outline all your options. Speaking of configuration, Tailwind is very configurable, as we already mentioned. This is an example of a Tailwind configuration file. This is a very basic one. You can see it's written in JavaScript. It's easy to scan and see what's being set. So even if you're not super familiar with JavaScript, it's written in a format that should make it pretty easy to get what's being set where. Now, there's two sort of modes to this configuration file. We talked about you can extend what comes with Tailwind out of the box. So if you want to add a couple variants to spacing or text size or colors, you can do that. Otherwise, you can create your own entirely custom config, get rid of all the defaults, and start from scratch. Now, when your design team hands you designs that are using the default scale, it's great to just use what's baked in with Tailwind out of the box. But if you get something that's totally custom, maybe doesn't even follow a scale, you can just set all those values manually in your config file and still use the full power of Tailwind CSS. Now, Tailwind also supports this idea of plugins, which is nice. And there's one plugin that I want to call out here. It's the Tailwind typography plugin. Now, this is a super powerful plugin that is great for CMS-driven websites. No doubt we all have WYSIWYG fields in our CMS setups where the client can put in who knows what, mostly headings, text, images, block quotes, maybe code. They can put a bunch of stuff in here, and we don't necessarily have control of what that end markup is going to look like. It's probably just going to be a bunch of plain HTML. So this Tailwind typography plugin is super powerful because once we install it, it gives us access to this magical prose class. So the way it works is you add this prose class to your wrapping elements of wherever your WYSIWYG content is going to be spit out in your template. And it has a bunch of pre-configured spacing, sizing on all the elements that would be within a WYSIWYG field. So this is what that looks like. This is using the typography plugin. You can see if we scroll down that paragraphs, quotes, lists, code blocks, headings, nested lists, pictures, all of it is properly spaced. It looks great, and it's perfect for long form reading through WYSIWYG content. Now, you may say that's great, but is it customizable? Well, yes, just like the rest of Tailwind, that is totally customizable. You can define in your config file how things are spaced between elements. So if you want to change the spacing between paragraphs and lists, you can. Again, the defaults are very sensible and I would say work well in most cases, but obviously depending on what designs you're handed, you can easily tweak those to match the comps you're given. So that plugin is one that will definitely come in handy in CMS type projects. Now, let's look at an example that we coded up here. This is, let's call this a card component. And as you can see here, we're just dealing with the HTML. We have 3 cards that we're creating, and there's like a heading of the section. This is just plain HTML. Let's figure out how we would do this in Tailwind. So let's talk about Tailwind Play. We're going to demo that card setup using this brand new tool. Literally came out yesterday, and it's a sandbox environment for testing Tailwind. So if you go to play.tailwindcss.com, you will see the default welcome component that explains how it works. As you can see, it's all rendering with Tailwind. There are 3 tabs: your HTML tab, a CSS tab, and a config tab. Obviously, you're not going to spend too much time in that CSS tab unless you're trying to do something fancy. For the most part, you'll be in that HTML tab. Or if you want to try some custom configuration options, you can do so in that 3rd tab. So for our purposes, let's go ahead and clear that out and paste in our card markup. You see we just have a stacked set of things. One of the nice things about Tailwind Play is that you can actually test responsive variants in the browser, which is what we're currently doing. So let's add some classes here and see how long it takes to get, let's do like a 3-column card layout. Let's start by putting everything in a container, some spacing. We'll do our section heading, make that look nice and centered. Test some of the responsiveness. Now let's use some of the grid utilities, and I mean, just like that, we're already in 3 columns here. Play with some of the spacing, some of the sizes on the text for these different card components. So we're figuring it out all out on this first card. For the sake of this demo, we're just going to copy it down to the other cards. So you can see the nice thing about Tailwind Play is it's all happening live, and we're getting helper hints. I believe it has VS Code running under the hood. We get these nice helpers to tell us what's going on. So we have our cards nicely styled. We copy and paste that 3 times. Let's adjust for some mobile responsiveness. And hey, now we have a desktop and a mobile view. Now, what we're looking at here is we're going to adjust the config file and throw in a custom font. So we just installed Roboto, and now we're playing with the heading and the top of the different options. All right, so we're done. That was about 20 seconds. We sped that up about 200%. Honestly, it took me a couple minutes to get to that level of detail. Obviously, full-blown card component, a little more work involved, but you can just see how fast it was to get that up and running. The grid helper utilities are fantastic. The Flexbox utilities are amazing. We got that card component done extremely quickly. So I want to circle back to some of the customizations we made after we got our card component done. So here you see we got our 3 cards. And we're going to go ahead and add a custom font. So I'm in the CSS tab here, and I just copied an import statement from Google Fonts. This has our font family for Roboto. So drop that in there. Tailwind Play is compiling everything on the fly, so it's pulling that in. Now, if I go to my config tab, this is an example of how we can extend Tailwind to do something else. So by default, there are some font families that it has set up. So if you do font-sans, it will include the default sans serif fonts that are configured. In this case, we want to override those with Roboto. So we have our font family object here, and we are using the sans key, and we're passing in Roboto. Pass in a bunch of other fallback fonts. It's an array, but we're just setting Roboto here. And out of the box, Tailwind is going to use the font sans on everything. So as soon as that finishes compiling, you'll see that the font changed. And then if we go, just to demonstrate some of the other font options out of the box, on our section heading here, we put font serif, which is going to force it to the serif version that comes with Tailwind, and then the monospace version that comes out of it. So very quickly, you saw we just changed the font family and made a responsive card component all in a matter of minutes. So you get real production ready code done in minutes. That's amazing. You don't have to switch between CSS and HTML files. You do it all in your HTML. You aren't wasting time and energy trying to come up with clever class names that are specific to whatever component. Your CSS stops growing. It's a pretty flat CSS file. All the utility components are one level. You don't have a bunch of nesting craziness going on. Just making changes to your code base, especially code bases that you've had for a while, as changes come in, it just feels safer to make adjustments. CSS is this globally scoped thing, and you never know what you're going to break when you start messing with the CSS file directly, when you start dealing with nested components, and this, you just know that when you make a change, it's going to be locally scoped to your HTML file you're editing, whatever component you're editing. You know what's going to happen. You don't have to worry about something else breaking, and that's just gives you so much peace of mind. You also don't have to like keep constantly compiling assets, which that's a huge thing in itself too. So let's quickly talk build process. We're not going to get too deep into it. You'll want to use something like Webpack or Rollup to handle your full build process. Tailwind, again, it's built on top of PostCSS. It's a PostCSS plugin. So my typical workflow is I'll run my build script in a local environment, and when it does that, it will generate every possible utility class name that is configured in my config file. This obviously is going to generate a pretty big file, a couple megabytes worth at least. The way it works is on your production builds, Purge CSS is built into Tailwind out of the box. And all you do is point your template folder to let Purge CSS know where that's at. And then on your production build, it's going to get rid of all the unused classes that aren't being used on your project. So you literally have the best of both worlds here. You have all the utility classes you could ever need, and then your production build only ships with the ones you actually use. Again, to pull from the Tailwind docs, this quote really sums things up. When you realize how productive you can be in just working in an HTML template file with your predefined utility classes, working any other way really does feel like torture. Yeah, really does. So let's talk rapid prototyping with Tailwind UI. Now, again, Tailwind UI is prefab components. This is their commercial offering. It's built using Tailwind CSS. It's still customizable. You're given blocks of HTML to copy over into your project that have all the Tailwind classes applied. You can edit them after you copy it over. There's no like dependency to Tailwind UI. It's literally copy paste and get your components customized however you need. There are two flavors of Tailwind UI. There's a marketing focused one and a app focused one. So marketing has like hero components, blog posts, team pages, pricing pages, things like that. The marketing flavor has UI for dashboards, alerts, modals, forms, things of that sort. Just to give you an example of what that looks like, this is an alert type modal, markup above. And once you copy and paste this, you can again customize this to your liking. This is the prefab component out of the box. Really great for prototyping stuff, for quickly getting visions on a page. And it is, again, infinitely customizable. So it's a great starting point for some projects as well. So we've talked about what Utility-First CSS is. We've talked about the type of mindset that you need to fully embrace it. We've talked about how Tailwind Labs is taking over the world with regards to pushing this utility-first approach. A lot of great tools we want to utilize, and that's in the space provided by them. Now, let's wrap this up by talking about how this whole philosophy fits in with our CMS-based sites, with projects that have multiple people on them, agency, studios, lots of people working on things on these CMS projects. How does this all tie together? So we talked about earlier that our complex layout logic happens somewhere. Typically, that was relegated to the CSS file itself. Your BEM flavored modifiers were used to pull off some different variants. Now, with this utility-based approach, this complex layout logic, it's still going to have to happen somewhere, except Now we want to leverage the power of our content management system's templating engine. And I have three principles or three rules of thumb that I go about when trying to determine how to break down my files. So I want to think about what's actually going to be reusable. I don't want to just make things components or separate them out for the sake of separating them out if they're only going to be used once. Then if I do realize, okay, there is the potential for reuse here, how am I going to go about doing that? My first layer would be to create, use the idea of template partials, which a lot of the CMS template engines provide. But I want to sort of build these components as dumb components so that they're just expecting data to be passed to them, nothing logical. I still want the CMS template parser to handle all the logic and basically just pass that data to these components and have variables that pre-fill with that content. And then the last resort, if I really need to extract something, is to use Tailwind's built-in apply feature, which we haven't talked about yet, and for good reason, but that is something we could use as a last resort. So let's look at this pretty long component file. And you can see a bunch of classes here. So my typical workflow is I'll build things out statically, sort of get the big picture of what's going on, and then try and establish patterns and see what makes sense to pull out, what makes sense to make a partial, or maybe use atomic design principles in how I'm structuring my template files. A couple of different ways to go about it, but I first want to just see what I'm working with. Now, if we look at another example, smaller component here. This is, say, a simplified card component too. You see we have these pseudo variables in here. That's where you would hook up your CMS template engine to pass in the data here. But if we make this its own component, and then using our CMS template engine, we're either including that, or depending on how much reuse this component's going to get, maybe all we need to do is just wrap it in a for loop, and we pass the data to it in a for loop. So at the end of the day, we still only have this code block defined once. It's not like we have three of these where those bunch of classes are defined multiple times on a page. That's what we're trying to avoid. If there is a genuine use for needing to reuse that component, we would figure out how to break that up. So template partial, maybe just a for loop in the template's all we need, but leverage the template engine to figure that out. Now, this whole discussion takes us back to thinking about how we're structuring the CMS in the beginning. A lot of CMS projects, or all CMS projects, really have a lot of thought put in at the beginning that goes into how the CMS is structured. Based on how we're doing our front-end development, it really gets out of the way for how the CMS is structured. At the end of the day, our HTML and compiled utility classes, they don't care how the files are broken up. It's really at the discretion of how we architectured the CMS, which is how it should be. Our separations of concerns at this point is now the CSS cares only about the presentation and how our components are put together, how data is being passed. It's really handled from our template engine from the CMS. Now, the power of the template engine gives us a lot of flexibility as well. Things that we wouldn't get like in our CSS if we were to do BEM or SMAX and have nested components. We can use the power of the template engine to keep our code dry using template partials or other methods, and maybe have some conditional content that there are slight variants. We need to change the font size or change the last item to have a border. Things of that nature makes it a lot easier to do in our HTML file that the template engine can just parse some conditional adding or removing of classes. Very simple, very straightforward. So the last part of all this we'll talk about briefly, I feel I have to, is the @apply feature of Tailwind. And basically what it does is lets you, this is actual CSS we're writing here. We are in a CSS file, and maybe there is a good use case where we want to extract this button class so that we don't have to apply these same 4 or 5 classes every time we have a button, or maybe the way we have our component for a button set up makes it a better idea to just define those classes in our CSS file. I'll typically have something called an extensions CSS file that houses these small little utilities here. For the most part, I stay away from the apply just because the rest of our workflow and logic is happening at the HTML and template level, and for the most part, it can accommodate everything we throw at it. But there may be an occasion where the apply directive works best here. And so that's what we have here, where you can see it's a little BEM-like. There are some cases where this is appropriate. For the most part, you shouldn't need it. I will mention in a newer version of Tailwind CSS, this apply directive gets a lot more powerful in that you can include responsive variants in the single apply, and it will generate all the appropriate classes. So it is a very powerful tool, but again, just wield it responsibly. For the most part, everything we do in our template engine layer and our HTML layer should be able to handle everything we would need to throw at it. So we've gone through a lot today. Is Utility-First CSS a good idea? Absolutely. I wholeheartedly would say yes, 100%. Now, there is no amount of justification or demonstration on my part that is going to convince you to try this if you have never done it. So all I can say is I strongly encourage you to open Tailwind Play. There's an example file there for you to get started. It explores the concepts of how to configure Tailwind, how to create components. Just use it to see what's possible. There's no setup required except opening your browser and going to play.tailwindcss.com. And I am confident, I'm willing to bet, that once you start down this path, you won't turn back. Thank you.